Kingsley Bennet stared out of the office window, the dim city lights flickering in the distance. His reflection, hollow-eyed and weary, looked back at him. It had been another grueling day at Bennet Financials, his once promising startup that now teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. The office was silent, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. His employees had long gone home, but Kingsley remained, as he often did, grappling with mounting debts and the suffocating weight of failure. It hadn't always been like this. 5 years ago, Kingsley had stood on this same floor, watching the skyline with pride. Back then, he was full of hope, confident that his company would revolutionize the industry. Rebecca, his wife, had been his rock during those early days, encouraging him through every setback and celebrating every minor victory. But now even she seemed distant. Rebecca's love had not faltered, but Kingsley felt her unspoken disappointment. They had mortgaged their home, drained their savings, and delayed starting a family, all for a dream that now felt like a cruel joke. Kingsley's thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. The name on the screen made his heart skip: Marcus Kane. Marcus had been his closest friend during their college years, a magnetic presence with an uncanny ability to inspire loyalty and admiration. While Kingsley had pursued a more conventional path, Marcus had vanished after graduation, resurfacing years later as an enigmatic entrepreneur whose wealth and influence were the stuff of legend. They hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, but now, out of the blue, Marcus was calling. "Marcus," Kingsley answered, his voice a mix of surprise and desperation. "Kingsley," Marcus's deep, smooth voice resonated through the line. "It's been too long, my friend. I heard about your troubles. Thought I'd reach out." Kingsley hesitated, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. "Yeah. Things haven't been great." "I know," Marcus said knowingly. "Why don't we meet? I'll be in town tomorrow. Let's catch up over dinner. My treat." Kingsley wanted to refuse. He hated the idea of Marcus seeing him like this, broken, defeated. But the allure of reconnecting with someone who had seemingly conquered life was too strong to resist. The next evening, Kingsley found himself at L'Ambrosia, an upscale restaurant he would never have set foot in otherwise. The dining room was a study in opulence. Crystal chandeliers, plush velvet chairs, and waiters who moved with the precision of dancers. Marcus was already there, seated at a corner table, his tailored suit and confident demeanor drawing admiring glances from other patrons. "Kingsley." Marcus rose, enveloping him in a firm handshake and a pat on the back. "You look well. It's good to see you." Kingsley smiled weakly. "You too, Marcus." As they settled into their seats, Marcus ordered an extravagant spread of dishes and an expensive bottle of wine. Kingsley tried to keep up appearances, but his unease was palpable. "So," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, "tell me what's been going on." Kingsley sighed, the floodgates of frustration opening. He recounted the struggles of his business, the strained relationship with Rebecca, and the overwhelming fear of losing everything he had worked for. Marcus listened intently, his sharp blue eyes betraying no judgment. When Kingsley finished, Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, Kingsley. To see your dreams slipping away while the world moves on without you. But I found a way out, a way to take control of my destiny." Kingsley frowned, intrigued but cautious. "What are you talking about?" Marcus swirled his wine glass, the crimson liquid catching the light. "It's not something I can explain in a single conversation. But if you're willing to trust me, I can help you. You don't have to live like this anymore." The intensity in Marcus's gaze sent a shiver down Kingsley's spine. "Help me how?" Marcus smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that seemed to hold the promise of everything Kingsley had ever wanted. "Meet me tomorrow night. There's someone I want you to meet." The following evening, Kingsley found himself driving to a secluded mansion on the outskirts of town. The address Marcus had given him led to an imposing estate surrounded by towering iron gates. As he approached, the gates creaked open, as if expecting him. Kingsley parked his car and walked up the stone steps, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Marcus greeted him at the door, his usual charm replaced by a solemn demeanor. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked. "For what?" Kingsley replied, his unease growing. Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he led Kingsley through the grand foyer, past ornate paintings and marble statues, to a hidden elevator at the back of the house. They descended into the depths of the mansion, the air growing colder with each passing second. When the elevator doors opened, Kingsley stepped into a dimly lit chamber. The room was vast, its walls lined with black candles that flickered ominously. At the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained with dark, unidentifiable marks. A group of hooded figures surrounded the altar, their faces obscured in shadow. "Marcus," Kingsley whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this?" Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This, my friend, is your salvation." A figure stepped forward, his robes more elaborate than the others. He removed his hood, revealing an older man with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through Kingsley. "Welcome," the man said, his voice a commanding blend of authority and allure. "You are here because you seek freedom from your burdens, because you desire power, wealth, and the life you've always dreamed of." Kingsley swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. What do I have to do?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "We are the Order of Avarice, a brotherhood bound by the pursuit of greatness. But greatness comes at a price. Are you willing to pay it?" Kingsley looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "It's worth it, Kingsley. Trust me." Desperation clouded Kingsley's judgment. He nodded. "Yes, I'll do whatever it takes." The leader's smile widened. "Good. Then let us begin." Kingsley's initiation was a blur of rituals and oaths, each more surreal and unsettling than the last. The final step was a blood pact, binding him to the order and its rules. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus pulled Kingsley aside. "Congratulations, my friend. You've taken your first step toward a new life. But remember, the path to power is not without sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Kingsley asked, though he already dreaded the answer. Marcus's expression darkened. "You'll know when the time comes. Just remember, nothing worth having comes without a cost." That night, as Kingsley drove home, his mind raced with questions and doubts. Yet, amidst the fear, a flicker of hope burned. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of possibility, a chance to escape the crushing weight of failure. As he pulled into his driveway, Rebecca met him at the door, her face etched with concern. "Where were you?" she asked. Kingsley hesitated, forcing a smile. "Just with an old friend." Rebecca studied him for a moment, then nodded, her worry giving way to relief. She kissed him on the cheek and led him inside. But as Kingsley lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed an invisible line. A line that, once crossed, would change his life forever. Kingsley sat at the dining table, his hands trembling as he held the ornate glass of wine Rebecca had poured for him. The flickering candlelight painted warm hues across her face, a stark contrast to the cold weight pressing on his chest. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with love and pride, feelings he no longer deserved. "This was a wonderful idea, Kingsley," Rebecca said, raising her glass. "It's been too long since we had a proper evening together." Kingsley forced a smile, his stomach churning. "You deserve it," he murmured. Rebecca's gaze softened, and she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "I know things have been hard, but I believe in you. I always have. No matter what happens, we'll get through it together." Her words, meant to reassure, cut deeper than any insult. Kingsley couldn't meet her eyes. He focused on the bottle of wine instead, its deep crimson hue reminding him of the vial in his pocket. The cult leader's words echoed in his mind. A small sacrifice to open the door to endless wealth. Begin with someone you love. It will bind you to the order and ensure your loyalty. Someone you love. Kingsley clenched his jaw, bile rising in his throat. Rebecca had been his anchor through every storm, the one constant in a life full of uncertainty. The idea of betraying her was unthinkable. Yet here he was, seated across from her, about to do the unthinkable. The night before, Kingsley had stood in the bathroom, staring at the small vial of clear liquid Marcus had given him. "It's painless," Marcus had assured him. "She won't suffer. And once it's done, you'll never have to worry about money again. You'll have everything you've ever wanted." Kingsley had wanted to throw the vial away, to tell Marcus he couldn't do it. But the image of his failing business, the debt collectors, and Rebecca's tired eyes had held him back. He had convinced himself it wasn't real, that the cult, the rituals, and the promises were some elaborate trick. Yet deep down he knew it was real. Marcus wouldn't have lied to him. "Are you all right?" Rebecca's voice pulled him back to the present. She was watching him, concern etched into her features. "I'm fine," Kingsley lied, his voice barely audible. Rebecca tilted her head, her expression softening. "You're not, but that's okay. We'll figure it out together, Kingsley. We always do." Her faith in him was unbearable. He wanted to scream, to tell her to stop looking at him like that, to run as far from him as she could. Instead, he reached for the wine bottle and refilled her glass. "Let's make a toast," he said, his voice trembling. Rebecca raised her glass, smiling. "To us." "To us," Kingsley echoed, the words hollow. As she sipped her wine, he watched her intently, waiting for some sign of what he had done. But Rebecca only smiled, oblivious to the poison seeping into her veins. An hour later, Kingsley sat by Rebecca's bedside, his heart pounding in his chest. She had begun to feel unwell halfway through the meal, complaining of dizziness and nausea. He had helped her to bed, his hands shaking as he tucked her in. "Maybe it was the wine," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe," Kingsley said, his throat tight. Rebecca reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I love you, Kingsley. No matter what." Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at her. "I love you too," he whispered, his voice breaking. For a moment, he considered calling an ambulance, confessing everything, and begging for forgiveness. But the cult leader's warning rang in his ears. "If you falter, you will lose more than wealth. You will lose everything." Rebecca's breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Kingsley held her hand, watching as the life drained from her body. When she exhaled her final breath, the silence that followed was deafening. Kingsley didn't know how long he sat there, frozen in place. His mind replayed the evening in excruciating detail. Her laughter, her trust, her love, all of it gone because of him. Eventually he forced himself to move. The cult had given him explicit instructions on what to do next. Rebecca's body had to be prepared for a ritual. Her soul offered to the order in exchange for Kingsley's new life. He carried her lifeless form to the basement, his legs threatening to give out with every step. The room had been prepared in advance, the altar set with candles and ceremonial tools he barely understood. As he laid her on the cold stone, he hesitated, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The ritual was a blur of chants and blood, the details too horrifying for Kingsley to process. When it was over, the room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The cult leader approached Kingsley, his expression one of satisfaction. "You've done well," he said. "The first sacrifice is always the hardest, but you've proven your loyalty. The rewards will come soon." Kingsley didn't respond. He couldn't. In the days that followed, Kingsley's life changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. A lucrative business deal appeared out of nowhere, wiping out his debts and catapulting his company to new heights. Investors flocked to him, contracts poured in, and his financial woes became a distant memory. But no amount of money could erase the haunting image of Rebecca's lifeless eyes. Her absence was a gaping wound, a constant reminder of the price he had paid. At night, Kingsley lay awake, tormented by visions of her. Sometimes she appeared in his dreams, her voice soft and accusing. "Why, Kingsley? Why did you do this?" Other times, he heard her laughter echoing through the empty house, a cruel mockery of the happiness they had shared. Despite his newfound wealth, Kingsley felt hollow. The man he had been, the man Rebecca had loved, was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. And yet, deep down, a small voice whispered that it wasn't over. The cult would demand more. Kingsley's wealth grew exponentially in the months following Rebecca's death. His company, once on the verge of collapse, became a thriving empire seemingly overnight. New clients appeared as if by magic, deals closed with effortless precision, and every risk he took turned to gold. On the surface, he was the epitome of success, a charismatic businessman with the Midas touch. But beneath the polished veneer, guilt and despair festered. Rebecca's absence haunted him. Her laughter echoed in the empty halls of their home, her ghostly presence a constant reminder of what he had done. He drowned himself in work, staying late at the office and throwing himself into his newfound wealth. Yet no amount of money or success could fill the void she had left behind. Then came Clara. Kingsley met Clara during a gala hosted by one of his new business partners. She was a striking woman, tall, elegant, and magnetic in her confidence. Her laughter lit up the room, drawing people to her like moths to a flame. Kingsley was no exception. Their courtship was swift and intense. Clara was ambitious and shrewd, and though she asked few questions about Kingsley's sudden wealth, she was clearly drawn to his power and influence. For Kingsley, Clara represented an escape from his guilt, a chance to start over and rebuild the life he had destroyed. They were married within 6 months. The ceremony was extravagant, a testament to Kingsley's newfound status, and the media hailed them as a power couple. Clara reveled in the attention, while Kingsley played his role as the devoted husband, burying his doubts and fears beneath layers of charm. When Clara announced her pregnancy, Kingsley felt a fleeting moment of joy, a glimmer of hope that perhaps this new life could redeem him. But the cult had other plans. The message came on a stormy night, delivered by Marcus himself. "You've done well," Marcus said as he stepped into Kingsley's study, shaking the rain from his coat. "The Order is pleased with your progress." Kingsley poured himself a drink, his hands trembling as he set the bottle down. "What do they want now?" Marcus's expression hardened. "You know what they want. The sacrifices don't stop, Kingsley. Wealth and power come at a price. You've paid the first, but there's more to come." Kingsley's stomach churned. "Clara doesn't know anything about this. She's pregnant, Marcus." "I can't." Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "It's not about what you can or can't do. It's about what you must do. The Order demands the purest sacrifice. Your firstborn child." The glass slipped from Kingsley's hand, shattering on the floor. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I can't do that. I won't." Marcus stepped closer, his voice cold and unyielding. "Do you think you can walk away from this? Do you think the Order will let you?" Rebecca was only the beginning, Kingsley. You knew what you were getting into. If you refuse, you'll lose everything. Your wealth, your freedom, your life. Kingsley sank into his chair, his mind racing. The memory of Rebecca's lifeless body flashed before his eyes, and he felt the walls closing in. "Why my child?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus's gaze softened, though his tone remained firm. "Because a child represents purity, innocence, and potential. The Order thrives on those qualities. Your child's sacrifice will cement your place among us and ensure your success for years to come." Kingsley buried his face in his hands, his resolve crumbling. He had thought he could control this, that the sacrifices would be limited to the people he chose. But now the price was unbearable. Clara gave birth on a crisp autumn morning. Their daughter, whom they named Emily, was perfect in every way. Her tiny fingers clutching Kingsley's as she gazed up at him with wide, innocent eyes. In that moment, Kingsley felt a love so profound it brought tears to his eyes. But the joy was short-lived. The cult's demands loomed over him like a shadow, and every time he looked at Emily, he felt the weight of his impending betrayal. He tried to convince himself that there must be another way, that he could outwit the order or find a way to protect his family. But deep down he knew the truth. There was no escape. The night of the sacrifice arrived too soon. Kingsley had spent the day in a daze, avoiding Clara and Emily as much as possible. Marcus had given him detailed instructions. The ritual required complete secrecy, and the child had to be offered before her first full moon. As the clock struck midnight, Kingsley entered the nursery, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily lay in her crib, sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Kingsley hesitated, his hands shaking as he reached for her. "I can't do this," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. But the image of Rebecca haunted him. Her death had already condemned him, and he knew that refusing the cult's demands would only bring more suffering. Kingsley carried Emily to the basement, his legs weak beneath him. The room was dark and cold, the altar prepared just as it had been for Rebecca. Candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He placed Emily on the altar, his hands trembling as he opened the ceremonial box Marcus had given him. Inside was a small, ornate hammer and a bowl lined with silver. Kingsley's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he had to do. He turned away, his stomach heaving, but the cult's chant echoed in his mind. "The purest sacrifice ensures the purest reward." "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." With a single horrific act, Kingsley shattered the last remnants of his humanity. The ritual was brutal, the cries of his newborn daughter piercing the silence before fading into an unbearable stillness. When it was over, Kingsley collapsed to the floor, his body racked with sobs. The room seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, and he felt the weight of the order's power settle over him. The following morning, Kingsley told Clara that Emily had died of sudden infant death syndrome. Her grief was devastating, and Kingsley hated himself for the lie. But Clara never suspected the truth, and in time, she channeled her pain into charity work, founding an organization to support families who had lost children. Kingsley, meanwhile, buried himself in his work, his wealth and influence growing with each passing day. But no amount of success could erase the memory of what he had done. Emily's cries echoed in his mind, haunting his dreams and turning his waking hours into a nightmare. He had thought that power would bring him peace, but instead it had left him hollow, a man consumed by his own darkness. And deep down, he knew the sacrifices weren't over. Kingsley sat alone in the corner of a crowded ballroom, nursing a glass of champagne as the hum of conversation and laughter buzzed around him. The gala was supposed to be a celebration of his company's latest success, a major merger that had solidified his status as one of the wealthiest men in the city. Yet he felt nothing. The wealth, the power, the admiration, it all felt hollow, tainted by the dark price he had paid. His thoughts were interrupted by a burst of laughter from across the room. He turned his head and saw her, Clara Thornton. She was radiant, her figure wrapped in a sleek emerald gown that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her smile was dazzling, effortlessly commanding the attention of everyone around her. Kingsley recognized her immediately. She was the daughter of a prominent politician and a rising star in the socialite circles. But what drew him to her wasn't just her beauty or her reputation. It was her confidence, her presence. She moved through the room like she owned it, and for a fleeting moment, Kingsley envied her freedom. As their eyes met across the room, Clara's smile shifted slightly, taking on an almost predatory edge. She excused herself from the group she was entertaining and began making her way toward him. "Kingsley Wright," she said, extending her hand. "I was wondering when we'd finally meet." Kingsley rose to his feet, shaking her hand. "Clara Thornton," he replied, his voice steady despite the sudden flutter of nerves in his chest. "It's an honor." "Please," she said with a laugh, "let's skip the formalities. I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Wright. Some say you've built an empire out of thin air." Kingsley smiled faintly. "I've been fortunate. "Fortune favors the bold," Clara said, her eyes glinting. "And you strike me as a very bold man." Her words lingered, heavy with unspoken meaning. Kingsley felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Desire, ambition, perhaps even hope. For the first time since Rebecca's death, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by guilt and regret. Their courtship was a whirlwind of lavish dinners, private jet trips, and exclusive parties. Clara was everything Kingsley needed in a partner. Intelligent, ambitious, and unflinchingly loyal to the lifestyle he could provide. She never pried into his past, never questioned the source of his wealth. To her, Kingsley was the ideal man, a self-made billionaire with the power to shape the world. But beneath the surface, Kingsley was plagued by doubt. The cult's demands were never far from his mind, and he knew that marrying Clara would only entangle her in his dark web. Yet he couldn't stop himself. When he proposed, Clara said yes without hesitation, her eyes shining with excitement at the life they would build together. Their wedding was a grand affair, the kind of event that graced the covers of magazines. Kingsley watched Clara walk down the aisle, her radiant smile lighting up the cathedral. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that this was his chance at redemption, that he could leave the past behind and start anew. But the cult's shadow loomed over him. The first few months of their marriage were blissful. Clara reveled in her new role as a society darling, hosting extravagant parties and throwing herself into philanthropic endeavors. Kingsley, meanwhile, tried to lose himself in their shared happiness, hoping that the order would spare her. But one evening, as he worked late in his study, Marcus appeared unannounced, his presence as unwelcome as ever. "Congratulations on your marriage," Marcus said, his tone devoid of warmth. Kingsley didn't look up from his desk. "What do you want?" Marcus chuckled. "You know what I want. The order is pleased with your progress, Kingsley. But the sacrifices must continue. Your wife will be next." Kingsley's stomach twisted. "No," he said firmly. "I won't do it." Marcus's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice. You swore an oath to the order. Your wealth, your power, none of it is yours. Belongs to us. And if you refuse, you'll lose everything." Kingsley clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had thought that marrying Clara would shield her from the cult's demands, that he could protect her. But now he realized how naive he had been. For weeks, Kingsley wrestled with his decision. Clara was oblivious to his turmoil, her days filled with charity galas and social events. She often tried to draw him out of his shell, encouraging him to join her in the world she loved so much. But Kingsley could barely look at her without feeling the weight of his betrayal. One night, as they lay in bed, Clara turned to him, her expression soft. "You've been so distant lately," she said. "Is everything all right?" Kingsley forced a smile. "Just work," he said. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her fingers tracing circles on his chest. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." Her words cut deeper than any knife. Kingsley closed his eyes, his resolve crumbling. He couldn't let her go, but he had no choice. The night of the sacrifice, Kingsley waited until Clara was asleep. He stood over her, the ceremonial dagger in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. She looked so peaceful, her auburn hair spread across the pillow like a halo. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. He raised the dagger, his hands shaking, and brought it down in one swift motion. The blade sliced through her neck with horrifying precision, her blood pooling on the silk sheets. Clara's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, her gaze locking onto his. The betrayal in her eyes was unbearable. As her body went limp, Kingsley collapsed to the floor, his hands slick with blood. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the ritual complete. The days that followed were a blur. Kingsley told the authorities that Clara had been murdered during a home invasion, a story that was eagerly devoured by the tabloids. The tragedy only seemed to heighten his mystique, cementing his status as a man who had overcome unimaginable loss. But the truth gnawed at him. Clara's death had been senseless, another step down a path that seemed to have no end. At night he dreamed of her, her voice echoing in his mind. Why, Kingsley? Why? He had thought that wealth would bring him happiness, but now it only brought more pain. And deep down, he knew the cult wasn't finished with him. With Clara gone, Kingsley thought he would find some respite from the growing darkness that consumed him. Yet her death didn't bring peace, only a deeper void that no amount of wealth or power could fill. The cult had tightened its grip on him, and Kingsley's growing empire only served as a gilded cage, a stark reminder of the price he paid for his prosperity. For months, he avoided Marcus and the Order, burying himself in his work and hoping to delay the inevitable. But Kingsley knew that the cult's demands would never cease. And when the summons came again, it was as if he had been waiting for it. Marcus arrived late one evening, his presence as cold and oppressive as ever. "You've done well, Kingsley," Marcus said, helping himself to a glass of Kingsley's scotch. "The Order is pleased. But your work is far from over." Kingsley didn't respond, his jaw tightening. Marcus continued, his tone devoid of emotion. "The next sacrifice must be pure, unspoiled. A virgin." Kingsley's heart sank. He had no illusions about what this meant. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why does it have to be someone innocent?" Marcus fixed him with a steely gaze. "Purity is a powerful currency, Kingsley. The energy it brings sustains the Order, fuels its power. You should know that by now." Kingsley turned away, his mind racing. He had already sacrificed so much. Rebecca, Emily, Clara. Each death weighed heavily on his conscience. And now the cult demanded yet another life. "Where do I even find someone like that?" he asked, his voice laced with bitterness. Marcus smirked. "Leave that to us. The Order has already identified the perfect candidate." Her name was Elise. She was a college student, barely 20, with wide, doe-like eyes and an innocence that seemed out of place in the modern world. Elise came from a modest background, working part-time at a local cafe to support herself while studying literature. Kingsley first saw her when he stopped by the cafe on a rare evening out. She was behind the counter, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun and her cheeks flushed from the heat of the espresso machine. There was an unassuming beauty about her, a quiet grace that made her stand out. He watched her for a long moment, guilt and revulsion warring within him. She had no idea who he was or what he was capable of, and the thought sickened him. Yet the Order's demands were absolute, and Kingsley knew he had no choice. Over the following weeks, Kingsley orchestrated their paths to cross. He began frequenting the cafe, always sitting in the same corner and ordering the same drink. At first, Elise barely noticed him, too busy with her work and studies to pay much attention. But Kingsley was persistent, using his charm and wealth to draw her in. "I see you're a fan of Tolstoy," he said one evening, gesturing to the book she had left on the counter. Elise looked up surprised. "You've read Anna Karenina?" Kingsley smiled faintly. "Long time ago. It's one of my favorites." From that moment, their interactions became more frequent. Kingsley played the role of the kind older man, offering advice and encouragement as Elise confided in him about her struggles and dreams. She spoke of her passion for literature, her desire to one day become a professor, and her hope of making a difference in the world. Every word she said felt like a dagger to Kingsley's heart. It wasn't long before Elise's trust in him deepened. She began to see him as a mentor, someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. When Kingsley offered to help pay for her tuition, she hesitated at first but eventually accepted, grateful for his generosity. But Kingsley knew his kindness was a facade, a mask to hide his true intentions. The closer he got to Elise, the more he hated himself. Her innocence and hope were a stark contrast to the darkness that consumed him, and he couldn't help but feel like a monster every time he looked at her. Yet the cult's demands loomed over him, and Kingsley knew he couldn't escape them. One night, after weeks of careful manipulation, Kingsley invited Elise to his estate under the guise of celebrating her academic achievements. She arrived in a simple dress, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the grandeur of his home. "This place is incredible," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Kingsley forced a smile. "I'm glad you like it." The evening was pleasant, almost normal. Kingsley went out of his way to make Elise feel comfortable, preparing a meal and engaging her in light-hearted conversation. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget the true reason she was there, to pretend that this was nothing more than a friendly dinner. But as the night wore on, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. When Elise finally grew tired and asked to leave, Kingsley's facade cracked. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. Elise looked at him, confused. "Sorry for what?" Before she could react, Kingsley grabbed her, his guilt and desperation driving him to act. Elise struggled against him, her cries echoing through the halls of the estate, but Kingsley's strength overpowered her. He took her to the basement, the space now transformed into a sinister shrine to the order. The room was cold and dark, the air heavy with the scent of candles and incense. Kingsley tied Elise to the ritual altar, her wrists and ankles bound with thick ropes. She screamed and pleaded with him, tears streaming down her face as she begged for her life. "Please," she sobbed, her voice raw. "Why are you doing this?" Kingsley couldn't meet her eyes. "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice hollow. He picked up the ceremonial whip, his hands trembling as he prepared to carry out the ritual. Marcus had been clear. The sacrifice didn't need to be immediate. The order thrived on suffering, on the slow erosion of hope and purity. "I'm sorry," Kingsley whispered as he raised the whip. The first strike echoed through the basement, Elise's scream piercing the silence. Kingsley closed his eyes, his guilt threatening to consume him. Each lash was a reminder of how far he had fallen, of the man he used to be and the monster he had become. Night after night, Kingsley repeated the ritual, his wealth and power growing with each act of cruelty. To the outside world, Elise had vanished without a trace, her disappearance a mystery that no one could solve. But to Kingsley, she was a constant reminder of his damnation, a living testament to the darkness that had claimed his soul. Kingsley's life spiraled further into a maelstrom of darkness after Elise's capture. Every lash, every scream echoing in the cold depths of the basement brought him more riches and power but also deeper torment. It was a life he had built on blood and betrayal, and the price of his soul weighed heavily on his mind. But even as he drowned in his guilt, Kingsley found himself unable to stop. The cult's grip was too strong, the promises of immortality and unyielding fortune too alluring. Yet something strange began to happen after Elise had been in captivity for nearly a year. The Order's emissaries began speaking of an unusual event, a disruption in their rituals, a disturbance in the spiritual balance that had always been their foundation. "You've done everything we've asked," Marcus said during a visit, his expression unusually grim. "But something is shifting. The Order demands another sacrifice." Kingsley bristled. "Another?" His voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. "I have given you everything, everyone. What more can you ask of me?" Marcus leaned closer, his voice a sinister whisper. "The next one must be extraordinary. Not just pure, not just innocent, she must be divine." The search for his next sacrifice consumed Kingsley. He withdrew from public life, spending long nights poring over occult texts and consulting the Order for guidance. He began to experience vivid dreams, visions of a woman with golden hair and a radiant aura, her presence both comforting and terrifying. And then one day she appeared. Her name was Seraphina, though she introduced herself simply as Sarah. Kingsley first met her under the most mundane circumstances. She had come to his estate claiming to be a veterinarian, responding to a request he hadn't remembered making. "I was told you have a sick dog," Sarah said as she stood on his doorstep, her face serene and her voice soft. She wore a simple white dress, her long blonde hair flowing in waves down her back. Kingsley stared at her, his heart pounding. There was no dog. He hadn't owned one in years. But something about Sarah's presence unsettled him. "I don't recall calling anyone," he said cautiously. Sarah smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. Perhaps it was a mistake. But I'm here now, and I'd hate to waste the trip. May I come in? Against his better judgment, Kingsley stepped aside and allowed her to enter. From the moment Sarah crossed the threshold, Kingsley felt the air shift. Her presence seemed to fill every corner of the estate, her movements graceful and deliberate. She carried herself with an otherworldly calm, as though she knew more than she let on. Over the next few days, Sarah became a regular presence in Kingsley's life. She claimed to be a traveling veterinarian, offering her services to those in need. Yet Kingsley noticed that she rarely spoke of her past or her work, instead steering their conversations toward more personal topics. "You live in such a beautiful home," she said one evening as they sat in the garden. "But it feels so empty." Kingsley tensed, her words striking a nerve. "I prefer it that way," he said curtly. Sarah studied him, her gaze piercing. "Do you? Or is it because you're afraid of what might fill it?" Her question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. As the weeks passed, Kingsley found himself both drawn to and wary of Sarah. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her kindness and wisdom seemed genuine, yet there was an undeniable mystery about her. The cult's demands pressed heavily on him. Marcus had been clear. The next sacrifice had to be someone extraordinary. And Sarah, with her radiant presence and almost supernatural aura, seemed to fit the description perfectly. But there was one problem. Kingsley couldn't bring himself to harm her. One night, as they shared dinner, Kingsley decided to test her. "Sarah," he began, his voice careful, "do you believe in destiny?" She smiled faintly. "I believe we all have a purpose, though we may not always understand it." "And what do you think your purpose is?" Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a solemn expression. "To bring light to the darkness," she said softly. "Even when it's painful." Kingsley felt a chill run down his spine. "What if the darkness doesn't want to be illuminated?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "It's not about what the darkness wants. It's about what the light must do." That night, Kingsley made his decision. He prepared the poison carefully, mixing it into a glass of wine. As he carried the glass to the dining room, his hands trembled. Sarah sat at the table, her expression serene as always. "To new beginnings," Kingsley said, forcing a smile as he handed her the glass. Sarah accepted it without hesitation, raising it to her lips. Kingsley watched in horror as she drank deeply, the liquid vanishing down her throat. But nothing happened. Sarah set the glass down, her expression unchanged. "You seem tense," she said, her voice calm. Kingsley stared at her, his mind racing. The poison should have worked, it had always worked before. Yet Sarah sat before him, untouched, her presence as radiant as ever. That night, Kingsley had a dream. He saw himself standing over Sarah, his hands wrapped around her throat as she smiled up at him. No matter how tightly he squeezed, she didn't resist. When he woke, his heart pounding, he turned to find Sarah lying beside him, her expression peaceful. Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled as though she knew what he had dreamt. "Good morning," she said softly. Kingsley felt a surge of fear and anger. He had to end this. Whatever Sarah was, she was a threat to his carefully constructed life. The next night, Kingsley retrieved the ceremonial sword he had used on Clara, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. He approached Sarah as she slept, her breathing steady and calm. "I'm sorry," he whispered, raising the sword high. He brought it down with all his strength, aiming directly at her neck. But the blade passed through her as though she weren't there, striking the pillow instead. Kingsley stared in disbelief, his hands trembling. He tried again and again, but each strike yielded the same result. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly. She sat up, her gaze calm as she looked at Kingsley. "What are you doing, my love?" she asked softly. Her words sent a shock through him. He recognized her voice, the familiarity and sadness in her tone. "Rebecca," he whispered, his voice breaking. Sarah smiled, her features softening. "It's me, Kingsley," she said. "I've been with you all along." Tears streamed down Kingsley's face as he fell to his knees, the weight of his sins crushing him. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I didn't know how to stop. I lost myself." Rebecca, Sarah, reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late," she said gently. "Go to the basement. Free Elise. Confess your crimes. It's the only way to make things right." Kingsley nodded, his resolve finally breaking. The air in the house was thick with a weight Kingsley could no longer bear. Sarah, Rebecca, her revelation had unraveled him. The calm resolve in her voice, the way she spoke of redemption, left him trembling. The person he had become, the monster, was now laid bare. For the first time in years, a flicker of humanity emerged in the void that had consumed him. His steps to the basement were hesitant, like a man walking toward his execution. As he descended the stairs, the memories of what he had done to Elise flooded his mind. The lashes, her screams, the pleading in her tear-filled eyes. The darkness in him had silenced the guilt for so long, but now it came roaring back, overwhelming him. "Forgive me," he whispered, unsure if the words were meant for Elise, Rebecca, or himself. The basement was cold and damp, the air stagnant and suffocating. The walls were lined with occult symbols, remnants of the rituals that had fueled his wealth and power. At the center of the room stood the altar, its surface stained with the evidence of his unspeakable acts. Elise was there, her frail body slumped against the restraints. Her once vibrant spirit had been replaced by a hollow shell, her head hanging low as if the will to fight had long left her. "Elise," Kingsley called softly, his voice cracking. Her head lifted slightly, her sunken eyes locking onto him. For a moment, there was no recognition, only a dull, lifeless stare. Then, as realization dawned, her expression shifted to one of fear and hatred. "You," she rasped, her voice hoarse from months of screaming. "Why are you here? What more do you want from me?" Kingsley swallowed hard, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. "I'm here to free you," he said, stepping closer. Elise flinched as he approached, her body trembling. "Stay away from me," she hissed. "Haven't you done enough?" Her words cut deeper than any blade. Kingsley knelt before her, his head bowed in shame. "You're right," he said. "I've done terrible things, things I can never undo. But I'm here to make it right. I'm going to get you out of here." Elise's eyes narrowed, suspicion etched across her face. "Why now? What's changed?" Kingsley hesitated, unsure how to explain. How could he tell her about Rebecca, about the strange encounter with Sarah, about the haunting realization that his wealth was built on the destruction of innocent lives? "Someone reminded me of who I used to be," he said finally. "And I can't live like this anymore." With trembling hands, Kingsley began untying Elise's restraints. The ropes were tight, cutting into her wrists and ankles, and he winced as he saw the raw, bloodied skin beneath. As he worked, Elise remained silent, her body tense as though she expected this to be some cruel trick. When the last rope fell away, she slumped forward, too weak to stand. Kingsley caught her, his arms encircling her fragile frame. "Don't touch me," she spat, her voice filled with venom. Kingsley quickly released her, stepping back to give her space. "I'm sorry," he said again, the words feeling hollow even to him. Elise struggled to her feet, leaning against the altar for support. Her gaze darted around the room, her survival instincts taking over. "There's a door upstairs," Kingsley said, gesturing toward the stairs. "I'll help you get out." Elise glared at him, her distrust evident. "Why should I believe you?" "You don't have to," Kingsley replied. "But I promise I'm done hurting people. I just want to make this right." As they made their way up the stairs, Kingsley couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Rebecca's voice echoed in his mind, her words urging him forward. When they reached the main floor, Elise paused, her eyes scanning the luxurious interior of the estate. It was a stark contrast to the horrors she had endured in the basement. "Go," Kingsley said, gesturing toward the front door. "You're free." Elise hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "What about you?" "I'm calling the police," Kingsley said, his voice steady. "I'm going to confess everything." Elise stared at him, disbelief and confusion warring on her face. "Why? Why now?" Kingsley met her gaze, his own filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "Because it's the only way to atone for what I've done." Elise didn't wait for further explanation. She bolted toward the door, her bare feet slapping against the marble floor. When she disappeared into the night, Kingsley let out a shaky breath, a small measure of relief washing over him. He walked to his study, his hands trembling as he picked up the phone. The number for the local police station was one he never thought he'd dial, but now it felt like his only salvation. The confession was grueling. When the police arrived, Kingsley met them at the door, his hands raised in surrender. The officers were wary, their eyes scanning the opulent surroundings as if trying to reconcile the image of a wealthy businessman with the crimes he was about to admit. "I want to confess," Kingsley said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I've done terrible things. There's a girl, Elise, she's escaped. You'll find evidence in the basement." The officers exchanged a glance before moving past him, their guns drawn as they descended the stairs. The discovery of the basement and its gruesome contents sent shockwaves through the police force. The symbols, the altar, the tools of torture. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. When the officers returned, their faces were pale, their expressions grim. "You're under arrest," one of them said, cuffing Kingsley's wrists. He didn't resist. As Kingsley sat in the back of the police car, his mind raced. He had finally done it. He had broken free from the cult's hold, but the cost was immeasurable. As they drove away from the estate, Kingsley caught a glimpse of Sarah, Rebecca, standing in the garden. She watched him with a faint smile, her form glowing in the moonlight. "Thank you," Kingsley whispered, unsure if she could hear him. The media frenzy that followed Kingsley's arrest was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His name, once synonymous with success and wealth, became a symbol of horror. His confession led to the dismantling of the order. The police uncovered other victims, other rituals, and other members of the cult. Kingsley's willingness to speak out saved countless lives, but it did little to absolve him in the eyes of the public, or himself. In the solitude of his prison cell, Kingsley found himself haunted by dreams of Rebecca. She appeared to him often, her presence both comforting and sorrowful. "You did the right thing," she said one night, her voice soft and kind. Kingsley shook his head. "It doesn't feel like it. I can never undo what I've done." Rebecca reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. "No, you can't. But you've stopped the darkness from spreading. That's something." As she faded from view, Kingsley felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he felt as though he could breathe. The prison was a far cry from the life Kingsley had once known. Gone were the sprawling estate, the lavish dinners, and the adoration of society. Now he was confined to a small gray cell with nothing but his guilt for company. Kingsley had always been a man of power, but here power meant nothing. The guards treated him with contempt, the other inmates eyed him warily, and the walls of the prison seemed to close in on him more each day. Yet, in the suffocating silence, Kingsley found himself thinking about Rebecca, Sarah, the woman who had saved him from himself. Her face was etched into his mind, her voice a soothing balm for his tortured soul. He often wondered if she had been real, if her forgiveness had truly come from beyond the grave, or if she was a figment of his broken mind. The nights were the hardest. Sleep offered no refuge, only dreams of the people he had wronged. Elisa's screams haunted him, Clara's lifeless eyes stared back at him, and Rebecca's voice whispered in his ear, sometimes with love, sometimes with reproach. One night, Kingsley awoke to find his cell bathed in an unnatural glow. He blinked, trying to focus, but the light didn't fade. In the corner of the room stood Rebecca, or what appeared to be Rebecca. "Hello, Kingsley," she said, her voice soft but tinged with sadness. Kingsley sat up, his heart pounding. "Rebecca, is it really you?" She didn't answer directly, only stepping closer. Her presence was both comforting and unnerving, her form shimmering as though she weren't entirely there. "You've taken the first step," she said. "But your journey isn't over." Kingsley frowned. "What do you mean?" I confessed. "Friedelise. What more is there?" Rebecca's gaze was piercing. "Redemption isn't a single act, Kingsley. It's a path you must walk every day. And the weight of your sins will never truly leave you." Over the next few weeks, Rebecca's visits became more frequent. Sometimes she would simply sit in silence, her presence a quiet reminder of the man Kingsley used to be. Other times she would speak to him, guiding him through his guilt and encouraging him to reflect on his actions. "Do you remember the first time we met?" she asked one evening. Kingsley nodded, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "You were working at that cafe. I spilled coffee on myself trying to impress you." Rebecca chuckled softly. "And I thought you were the most charming idiot I'd ever met." The memory brought a pang of sadness. Kingsley had been a different man then, young, ambitious, but still full of hope and love. How had he become the monster who destroyed the woman he once adored? One day, Rebecca's demeanor shifted. She appeared more somber than usual, her gaze heavy with emotion. "There's something you need to do, Kingsley," she said. "What is it?" "You need to write," she said simply. Kingsley frowned. "Write? About what?" "Everything," Rebecca replied. "The people you've hurt, the things you've done, the choices that led you here. Share your story so others can see the cost of their greed, their ambition. Show them what it means to lose your soul." The idea filled Kingsley with dread. Writing it all down would mean reliving every horrific act, confronting the darkest parts of himself. But he knew Rebecca was right. Kingsley requested a pen and paper from the guards, and after some hesitation, they granted his request. Sitting at the small desk in his cell, he began to write. The words came slowly at first, his hand trembling as he recounted the events that had led him to this point. He wrote about Marcus, the cult, the rituals, and the sacrifices. He wrote about the wealth and power that had consumed him, and the lives he had destroyed in the process. Each sentence felt like a knife to the heart, but Kingsley pressed on, pouring his guilt and remorse onto the pages. As the days turned into weeks, the writing became a form of catharsis. Kingsley began to see his story not just as a confession, but as a warning to others. He hoped that by sharing his descent into darkness, he could prevent others from making the same mistakes. Rebecca continued to visit him, offering words of encouragement and guidance. "You're doing well," she said one evening, her voice filled with pride. "But don't forget to be honest. Not just about what you did, but why you did it." Kingsley nodded, her words echoing in his mind as he returned to his writing. When Kingsley finished his manuscript, he handed it to the warden with a simple request: "Send this to the press." The warden raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Why should I?" "Because it's the truth," Kingsley said. "And people need to hear it." Reluctantly, the warden agreed. The publication of Kingsley's story sent shockwaves through the world. Titled The Cost of Greed, the manuscript detailed his rise and fall, exposing the horrors of the cult and the true price of his wealth and power. The response was overwhelming. Some people condemned Kingsley, calling him a monster who didn't deserve forgiveness. Others praised his honesty, seeing his confession as a brave attempt to make amends. But for Kingsley, the opinions of others mattered little. He hadn't written the manuscript for redemption or sympathy. He had written it for Rebecca, for Elise, and for all the lives he had destroyed. In the quiet of his cell, Kingsley felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He knew he would never be free from the weight of his sins, but for the first time, he felt as though he was on the path to becoming a better man. Rebecca's visits became less frequent, her presence a reminder of the life he had lost and the love he had squandered. One night, as she stood in the corner of his cell, Kingsley looked at her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Rebecca smiled, her form beginning to fade. "You're stronger than you think, Kingsley," she said. "Keep walking the path." And with that she was gone. Kingsley's days in prison began to take on a strange rhythm. Between meals, chores, and his ongoing reflections, his world felt both monotonous and charged with unease. The manuscript's publication had stirred something both outside the prison walls and within. Other inmates began treating him differently, not with reverence or fear, but with a wary curiosity. Some were intrigued by his story. Others scorned him, branding him a lunatic who deserved far worse than imprisonment. But it was the nights that truly tested him. The first incident happened a few days after the manuscript had gone public. Kingsley was lying on his narrow cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, when he heard a faint whisper. "Kingsley!" He bolted upright, his heart pounding. The voice was familiar, achingly so. "Rebecca!" he whispered into the darkness. The cell remained silent, but the whisper had felt so real. It wasn't the first time he thought he'd heard her since she stopped appearing in his dreams. The next night, the whisper came again, but this time it was different, more sinister. The voice didn't belong to Rebecca. It was deeper, raspier, and filled with malice. "Do you think you've escaped us?" it hissed. Kingsley's breath caught in his throat. He scanned the cell, his pulse racing. "Who's there?" The voice chuckled, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small space. "You thought you could walk away. The order doesn't forgive. The darkness you embraced still clings to you." Kingsley backed into the corner of his cell, his hands shaking. "You're not real," he said, more to convince himself than anything else. "You're just in my head." "Am I?" the voice taunted. The whispers continued throughout the night, each one cutting deeper into Kingsley's psyche. By morning he was a wreck, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. In the days that followed, the haunting escalated. Kingsley began seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision, hearing footsteps that seemed to follow him even when he was alone. His cell grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive weight. He confided in the prison chaplain, an older man named Father Jonathan who had seen his fair share of broken souls. "I feel like I'm being haunted," Kingsley admitted one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the darkness I tried to leave behind is coming for me." Father Jonathan regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and caution. "The weight of your sins can manifest in many ways," he said. "Sometimes it's guilt. Other times, it's the echoes of the evil you've done. But this feels real," Kingsley insisted. "I can hear it." "Yep." Father Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder. "The mind is a powerful thing, Kingsley. But so is the soul. If you truly wish to be free of this darkness, you must confront it head-on. Seek forgiveness. Not just from others but from yourself." Kingsley nodded, though the advice felt inadequate. How could he confront something that felt so far beyond his understanding? That night, the haunting reached its peak. Kingsley had just lain down to sleep when the temperature in the cell plummeted. His breath formed clouds in the air, and an unnatural darkness seemed to seep into the room. "Kingsley," the voice called again, louder this time. He sat up, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" The shadows in the cell coalesced into a form, a tall, menacing figure with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce his very soul. "You can't escape us," it said, its voice a low growl. "You think your confession absolves you. You think you can walk away from the pact you made." Kingsley shook his head, his back pressed against the wall. "I didn't walk away. I've paid the price. I've given up everything." The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down Kingsley's spine. "The price is never fully paid, Kingsley. You belong to us." "No," he said firmly, though his voice trembled. "I don't." "Broke free. Rebecca, she saved me." The figure leaned closer, its face inches from his. "Rebecca is gone. And soon so will you be." As the figure vanished, Kingsley fell to his knees, shaking. He realized he couldn't fight this battle alone. The darkness that had once consumed him was still there, waiting for a chance to reclaim him. Desperate for answers, he turned to the Bible Father Jonathan had given him. Though Kingsley had never been a religious man, He found himself drawn to the passages about redemption and forgiveness. The words brought him a small measure of comfort, a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. But it wasn't enough. The next morning, Kingsley requested a meeting with Father Jonathan. "I need your help," he said, his voice urgent. Father Jonathan nodded. "What can I do?" I think I need an exorcism," Kingsley said, the words feeling strange as they left his mouth. The chaplain's expression shifted to one of concern. "That's a serious request, Kingsley. Are you sure?" Kingsley nodded. "I've been hearing things, seeing things. I don't think this is just in my head. I think the cult. I think they left something behind in me." Father Jonathan considered this for a moment before nodding. "If this is what you believe, then we'll do what we can. But remember, Kingsley, an exorcism isn't just about driving out evil. It's about filling that void with something good." The process was grueling. Father Jonathan and 2 other chaplains gathered in Kingsley's cell, their prayers filling the space with a solemn energy. As the exorcism began, Kingsley felt a surge of unease. The air grew thick, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. "Leave this man," Father Jonathan commanded, his voice steady. "He has renounced you. He belongs to the light now." The shadows writhed, and Kingsley felt a searing pain in his chest. It was as though something was being ripped from him, clawing and screaming as it went. "Hold on, Kingsley," Father Jonathan said. "You're stronger than this." The ordeal lasted hours, but when it was over, Kingsley felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had clung to him for so long was gone. For the first time in years, he felt as though he could breathe freely. "Thank you," he said to Father Jonathan, his voice filled with gratitude. The chaplain smiled. "The battle isn't over, Kingsley. But you've taken a step in the right direction." That night, Kingsley dreamed of Rebecca again. She stood in a field of golden light, her expression serene. "You're free now," she said, her voice warm. Kingsley nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Rebecca smiled, her form beginning to fade. "Walk the path, Kingsley, and never look back." When he woke, Kingsley felt a newfound resolve. He couldn't undo the past, but he could dedicate the rest of his life to making amends. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt as though he was truly moving forward.